Good evening, everyone. You stood before I expected. I was ushered in. I like that. Welcome to the first Friday night lecture of the year. I'm Sarah Davis. I'm the Dean of the Santa Fe campus. We have a Friday night lecture every Friday during the semester, and I want to encourage you, students particularly, to come. We have a really nice slate this fall. It's a nice way to round off your week. I also want to take this as an opportunity to plug my study group, which is going to continue this year. It's on Fridays at lunch, and I take a small portion of the seminar reading from different years, and anyone is invited. It's a small enough reading that you can do it in advance. So if you're a freshman and you want to do a little bit of Hegel next Friday, check the ephemera and come and talk, second floor, Levin Hall. So I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll have a 10-minute break for refreshments and come back for questions. Okay, tonight my lecture is entitled Pulling Away from the Bank, Philosophy and Friendship in War and Peace. In many ways, the education at St. John's suggests to us that human beings, whether we like it or not, are drawn to the conventional, the ordinary, the normative. Like moths to a flame, we slip comfortably into the idioms of life. In our words and expressions, the common trends, opinions, and patterns of our day, we often find ourselves unwitting conformists. However, we also discover in so many ways, for ourselves as well as for the characters we come to love, the magnificent possibility of being jarred, shaken, woken up, recalling for a time the limits of convention, the truth that evades or reinvigorates idiom. Prince Andrei gazing at the sky, Elizabeth Bennet facing herself as if for the first time, Alyosha lying on the earth weeping, Kant's antinomies of reason, Beethoven's grand dissonant chord in the first movement of the Eroica. Though inevitably bound by the patterns of the ordinary, of custom and convention, we are moved by the extraordinary when it hits us. Most profoundly, perhaps, when we see how integral it is to the ordinary itself. This lecture focuses on war and peace in an effort to reflect on the situation that we find ourselves in. Neither simply chained to the walls of Plato's cave, nor simply bathed in the light of the sun, but somehow fundamentally in between. Unwitting followers and then seekers, penned in and then free, sleepwalking and then awakened, lost and then found. War and Peace is a big book. A lot happens in it. One notices, though, that there's a kind of rhythm to the lives of two principal characters, Prince Andrei and Pierre, the way in which they are drawn into projects and plans, commitments, loves, and beliefs. They are enlivened by these things, and we experience their humanity bloom. Then, for different reasons in different contexts, they find themselves stranded again, seemingly starting from scratch. The questions, what is the meaning of it all? How to go on with purpose? What is important? What is true? Who am I? Rising again in full force, as if for the first time. They take these questions seriously and try to live according to their most honest answers to them. This wave of blooming and then wilting, when abstracted, as I'm doing here, being all in and then finding oneself stranded, all out, over and over, risks seeming absurd. The idea that a single person could continually be strung along, sure that this time the awakening or renewal or soaring of soul is total and true, only to come up empty again, can seem deeply unreasonable, difficult to take seriously. But maybe that's why the book has to be so long, so detailed. Over the course of the novel, enmeshed in the particulars of the story, the possibility that military glory presents, the allure of a beautiful woman, the powerful promise of a spiritual doctrine or philosophical insight, the totalizing enchantment of true love, the palpable spirit of one's homeland. I don't find these pulls absurd as we watch them unfold. Rather, I am moved by rich and impassioned human lives. Pierre and Andrei are not unreasonable, but brave, soulful, and beautifully human. In very different ways, they do not give up on meaning and truth as the grounds for living. Each man struggling to live truthfully, to explore his full human possibility. Andrei is driven to pull back the veil once and for all, to resist being a moth to the flame. Pierre is less steadfast, flitting in and out, but he is no less committed. It's possible to read War and Peace through the frame of Andrei and Pierre, and ultimately, we are drawn to compare them. We can't help it, I don't think. But though the comparison presents itself, a comparison I will suggest is replicated in the two epilogues of the book, it is not in one or the other of these characters that the book gives us the most meaningful way forward. The differences between these two characters' attempts to live meaningfully is overshadowed by the beauty of their friendship. Likewise, in a certain light, as readers, our struggle to reconcile the epilogues of the book gives way to something much more important, a sort of friendship with the book itself. We live, all of us, in worlds of idiom and convention, but at the same time, there's something profound and mysterious about what we are that is not reducible to convention. War and Peace puts me in touch with that thing. It's beautiful and it's grand. The characters go through much struggle and suffering, both physically on the battlefield, as well as inner moral suffering, and the suffering doesn't exactly resolve. But rather than leaving me despondent, saddened by the trials of human life, I feel uplifted, hopeful, joyful even. And so my most fundamental question tonight is why? What is the ground I'm standing on as this book moves me toward life, toward meaning, toward the bloom of my own humanity? And how do Andrei and Pierre help bring me there? Part 1, the drawing room. We are first introduced to Pierre and Andrei in the opening scene of War and Peace at Anna Pavlovna's high society party. If it is true that there are times when we as humans bloom, when we become more present to the truth of things, our thinking and living more expressive of that truth, we have to grant that we are not always, maybe even often, in that state. There are philosophical arguments, many of which you have or will encounter at St. John's, that consider the tension between superficiality and depth, seeming and being, the phenomenal and the noumenal, the sophist and the philosopher. While these arguments are at stake in War and Peace, Tolstoy does not begin with an intricate philosophical framing. He only needs this opening scene to invoke something we all recognize. Anna Pavlovna's drawing room is dominated by predetermined patterns and conventions that people take way too seriously. Excuse me. The beautiful women carefully decorated, curating their movements and responses to the expectations of the room. The men holding court with well-rehearsed arguments in different conversation circles. And all the while, Anna Pavlovna orchestrating enough vitality to make the soiree a success, but not so much that anything natural, unexpected, or truly interesting can happen. It's a relief when we're introduced to two characters who don't fit in. Pierre Bezukhov, who has not yet inherited his fortune, is unaccustomed to society life. Pierre is, quote, clumsy, fat, unusually tall, broad, with enormous red hands. He did not, as they say, know how to enter a salon, and still less did he know how to leave one, end quote. Prince Vasily, Pierre's relation, turns to Anna Pavlovna at the beginning of the party and says, "Educate this bear for me." When Pierre manages to strike up a conversation with a guest and the two men, quote, listen and talk too animatedly and naturally, end quote, for the hostess's liking, Anna Pavlovna quickly separates them. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, on the other hand, is a, quote, rather handsome young man with well-defined and dry features, end quote. He is at ease as he enters the drawing room, knowing everyone, but, quote, so sick of them all that it was very boring for him to look on them, end quote. He wears a weary gaze and at times, quote, a grimace that spoiled his handsome face, end quote. We notice Andrei, but at first he might not appear to transcend the relentless idle talk of the room. That is, until he runs into Pierre. Andrei's affection for Pierre, given Pierre's oddity, speaks highly of him. On, quote, seeing Pierre's smiling face, Andrei suddenly smiles an unexpectedly kind and pleasant smile. He exclaims, "Well, well, so you too are in high society." "I knew you'd be here," Pierre replies softly, not wanting to interrupt a viscount who is in the middle of a long diatribe. "I'll come to you for supper," he says. Later, when Pierre and Andrei meet for supper, they talk about their lives, Pierre's struggle to settle on a career path, and Andrei's distress over marriage. Prince Andrei, only married a few years, his young wife pregnant, yearns to be free, feeling that marriage has compromised his most important possibility. Andrei cites Napoleon, whom both Pierre and Andrei idolize. Bonaparte, Andrei says, quote, went step by step toward his goal. He had nothing except his goal and he reached it. But bind yourself, and like a prisoner in irons, you lose all freedom. Drawing rooms, gossip, balls, vanity, triviality. I'm now going to war, to the greatest war that has ever been, end quote. Pierre and Andrei's conversation, unlike the party they've come from, is not performative, but probing and direct. It weaves in and out of argument, advice, questioning, steeped in mutual respect and affection. When Andrei's wife, Prince Lise, enters momentarily, and she and Pierre discuss teasingly why on earth Andrei would want to go to war, the little princess brings the idle talk with her. Quote, I keep telling him, here he's his uncle's adjutant, a most brilliant position. He's so well known, so appreciated by everyone. The other day I heard a lady ask, so that's the famous Prince Andrei. He could easily become an imperial adjutant, end quote. This talk is in high contrast to Andrei and Pierre's private conversation and takes the air out of the room. The drawing room scene frames the beginning of the book, and the superficiality of society is overbearing in the first 100 pages or so, but the presence of Pierre and Andrei create a crack in the facade of Anna Pavlovna's party, suggesting the promise of something much, much greater. Part 2, Andrei. Not long after, Andrei does go to war, and for a time he seems to find a more honest and purposeful existence. His intelligence, nuanced understanding of military operations, and fundamental nobility in the face of the tasks before him lead Andrei to be respected and honored in this new context. He begins to bloom. Napoleon looms large for him during this time. Andrei looks forward to his moment, like Napoleon's first victory at Toulon, a moment that will call, quote, for his swiftness of reflection and decisiveness, in which he will lead the Russian army out of a hopeless situation and open for him the first path to glory, end quote. We meet many young men in the novel who are intoxicated by the possibility of military glory, but Andrei is not like the others, at least not simply. His yearning goes beyond the eagerness many young men have on the eve of battle, which Tolstoy describes as, quote, the happy air of a schoolboy called up before a large audience for an examination in which he feels sure he will distinguish himself, end quote. While Andrei, too, has a desire for recognition, his ambition is rooted in an almost metaphysical drive to make his life reflect his great possibility. He has a powerful sentiment of human potential, his own potential, and he knows that the world he has lived in up until that point has not made room for its full expression. Risking one's life in the name of a greater goal only occurs to the kind of being, a human being, who has a sense of themselves as possessing something more, which goes beyond the satisfaction of physical needs, something that is worth dying for. The rapture expressed by the Russian soldiers when they are in the presence of the sovereign Alexander is a powerful example of this. On seeing the young Tsar approach their ranks, quote, the same feeling was experienced by every man in that army, a feeling of self-forgetfulness. It would only take one word from this man for the whole mass to go through hot fire and water. One could not help but tremble and thrill at the sight. Hurrah, 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 thundered on all sides, end quote. However, though the soldiers experience such intoxication, not many are as self-aware or hold themselves as accountable to it as Andrei does. The urge to express this something more, to turn oneself inside out, so to speak, and reveal the greatness within, tends to move from the untethered and sublime hurrah into a determinate action or set of actions, which never quite capture the grand movement of soul that elicited them. Andrei is not unique because he has such movement of soul, although perhaps this movement is particularly pronounced in him, but rather because of something like his will to truth. Andrei notices and cares when worldly projects that arise from this transcendent urge fall short of what it truly is. In a moment much later in the novel, enraptured by Natasha's singing, quote, "In the middle of a phrase, Prince Andrei fell silent and suddenly felt choked with tears. He was happy, but at the same time he felt sad. The main thing he wanted to weep about was a sudden, vivid awareness of the terrible opposition between something infinitely great and indefinable that was in him and something narrow and fleshy that he himself and even Natasha was. This opposition tormented him and gladdened him while she sang," end quote. Andrei's keen awareness of this opposition, which torments and gladdens, is his great gift, and likely also what makes it so hard for him to live. He yearns to reconcile the indefinable greatness he senses with the world he knows. And his will to truth is felt by those around him. He is steadfast and noble, directed by a kind of higher calling. At times this comes across as pride or arrogance, but for those who know him well, it is clear that he applies his standards most stringently to himself. Early in the novel, Andrei imagines it is by risking his life for his country that such reconciliation will take place. And at the Battle of Austerlitz, he gets the opportunity he has been longing for. The Russian troops come under attack and the battle rages. The officer holding the standard is shot and lets it drop. Russian soldiers begin firing chaotically without orders. Andrei, sensing imminent collapse, jumps off his horse and seizing the standard, runs forward shouting, "Forward, lads, hurrah!" The soldiers respond, one, then the other, then the whole battalion, emerging from the fog, charging forward with a unified shout, "Hurrah!" In this important moment, Andrei is as courageous, decisive, and self-possessed as he knows he will be. However, despite his heroic action, the momentum of the battle simply isn't in the Russians' favor, and as the soldiers charge forward, they fall on each side of him. Andrei keeps his composure, focusing on what is coming, but then a pain in his head distracts him and all goes blank. When he opens his eyes, something unexpected happens. He does not return to his directed heroic activity. Quote, "There was nothing over him now except the sky. The lofty sky, not clear, but still immeasurably lofty, with gray clouds slowly creeping across it. How quiet, calm, and solemn. Not at all like when I was running," thought Prince Andrei. "Not like when we were running, shouting, and fighting. It's quite different, the way the clouds creep across this lofty, infinite sky. How is it I haven't seen this lofty sky before? And how happy I am that I finally come to know it. Yes, everything is empty. Everything is a deception, except this infinite sky. There is nothing except that," end quote. During this time in the army, Andrei's faith in military glory has already begun to falter. His fellow soldiers, preoccupied with climbing in rank, by generals whose endless war room speeches are more about undermining each other and showing off than problem solving, and by hard-won victories that go unrecognized, unheeded, because they don't fit the narrative being constructed. But lying on his back at Austerlitz, Andrei sees suddenly, starkly, what had been suggesting itself to him in bits and pieces. His ambition to distinguish himself and win the war for Russia had been masquerading as whole, total, and pure, as the set of actions which would allow him to embody his greatest possibility, in real time to dissolve the boundary between his seeming and his being, to get out of the drawing room once and for all. But with death at hand, he recognizes that his actions could never be that pure. Not only the meaning of his actions, but even the meaning of his hero Napoleon's actions are fundamentally limited, narrow, contingent. Such actions are unable to touch the most important truth. The kind of bloom they offer, he decides then and there, is for those who have never seen the sky. Even the long-desired realization of his heroic possibility is nothing in comparison. One might expect Andrei's encounter with the sky that day to mark a movement into a kind of enlightenment and peace, but it doesn't. His highly rational and disciplined nature cause him to hold tight to the lesson that everything is empty, everything is a deception, except this infinite sky. He leaves military service, retreats from society, and resists being pulled into worldly projects, spiritual awakenings, and personal attachments. When Pierre visits Andrei during this time, Pierre notices that, quote, raptures, dreams, hopes for happiness and the good seem to be improper in front of Prince Andrei, end quote. It is in this condition, on one spring day, riding through a grove of luscious, newly blooming birches, that Andrei sees an old oak that has not flowered. Quote, it alone did not want to submit to the charm of spring, and did not want to see either the springtime or the sun. Andrei takes comfort in what the oak seems to be expressing. He addresses the blooming birches, quote, spring and love and happiness, and how is it you're not bored with the same stupid, senseless deception, always the same and always a deception, end quote. He turns to the old oak, quote, yes, it's right, 1,000 times right, this oak. Let others, the young ones, succumb afresh to this deception, but we know, end quote. The question that begins to form here and follows Andrei throughout his life and us throughout the book is about the pull of the bloom and whether leading a meaningful life means leaning into the bloom or resisting it. Andrei strives to discover and live according to truths that reflect the vastness of the infinite lofty sky, truths that lie beyond the same stupid, senseless deception. And in a very important way, he's not wrong. We watch as characters are pulled in by deceptive blooming surfaces, fleeting or false loves, social status and affluence, transcendent philosophies that enliven souls but end up being just another means of social climbing. Soldiers who in the rapture of self-sacrifice race toward death pointlessly. The deception Andrei detects is real, and his striving to resist it noble. In the moments he confronts the inescapable cycle of blooms, the seductive layer of life that blocks out the truth of the sky, he becomes disenchanted with everything around him. Quote, that boundless, ever-receding vault of the sky that used to stand over him suddenly turned into a low, definite, oppressive vault in which everything was clear and nothing was eternal or mysterious, end quote. However, though he is clearly onto something, his insistence that the bloom is the source of deception and therefore must be resisted misses something vital about the very truth he longs for. A week or so after he sees it for the first time, the old oak tree does, in fact, bloom, quote, spreading out a canopy of juicy dark greenery, barely swaying in the rays of the evening sun, of the gnarled fingers, the scars, the old grief and mistrust. Nothing could be seen, end quote. And likewise, despite his resolve, time and again, life comes rushing back for Andrei. With time, he does return to society life, to politics, and to the military. He becomes enthralled for a time with General Speransky, who temporarily takes the place of Napoleon in his mind as the, quote, living ideal of that perfection for which he strove, end quote. And in perhaps the greatest bloom of the book, Andrei falls in love with Natasha. As a character who desires to live in the truth, to face things for what they are, it becomes clear again and again the bloom is part of that. And in fact, Andrei's blooming is one of the great wonders of the book. When, for example, after meeting Natasha, a, quote, causeless springtime feeling of joy and renewal came over Andrei, all the best moments of his life suddenly recalled themselves to him. Austerlitz with a lofty sky, Pierre on the ferry, and a girl excited by the beauty of the night and that night itself and the moon. All of it suddenly recalled itself to him. No, life isn't over at the age of 31, end quote. As readers here, we don't begrudge him this movement toward renewal and hope, but rather we see what is best in him begin to surface. However, though life comes time and again for Andrei, he cannot shed his sense that the truth he seeks has a purity that lies beyond it. This leads him to appropriately drop Speransky as a role model and makes him forever suspicious of the drawing rooms he enters, but it also leads him ultimately to heed his father's shrill warnings and to demand a year-long test of his and Natasha's love, to know for certain if it is real and not fleeting. During this time, Andrei tells Natasha, quote, you will test yourself. I ask you to make me happy in a year, but you're free, and if you become convinced that you don't love me or that you love, he trails off. This year-long test, which Andrei insists is important for Natasha herself to decide if she truly loves him, is devastating for her. Quote, "Don't leave," is all she says to him when he takes his leave of her, in a voice which he remembered long afterward, end quote. During this year of Andrei's absence, Natasha's cries, "Oh, why doesn't he come?" and "Ah, my God, why isn't he here?" echo through the pages. Natasha is very young, and one might read the fact that she does not, in the end, pass the test as evidence that Andrei was right, either that their love was impulsive and fleeting, or that all love is impulsive and untrustworthy, and that subduing it, to examine it, is the only way to reveal it for what it truly is. But this is not the tenor of the realization, especially given the trajectory of their relationship through the rest of the novel. Rather, it has tragic misunderstanding at its root. The test insists that the intoxicating indeterminacy of a living, emerging love somehow show itself in full, that the veil be pulled back and the essence of the beating hearts revealed. But rather than exposing the truth of the love, this test tyrannizes it. The demand that Andrei makes on the love seems to warp rather than to reveal its true nature. And though we admire Andrei for his commitment to living deeply and meaningfully, we're put in a position to question the tyrannical character of Andrei's will to truth, his radical demand that the sky touch the earth. Part 3, Pierre. Pierre, unlike Andrei, has little, if any, affinity for the old oak. Pierre is swept up in the bloom of living, breathing, mistake-making. He indulges in food and drink and revelry. He falls in love too easily. He's swayed too quickly by the beauty and promise of spiritual and philosophical doctrines. But Pierre is not a fool. His flexibility is not superficiality. When the falseness of people and of doctrines reveal themselves to him, he abandons them with great force, wounded and disillusioned by the realization. One of Pierre's great virtues is his naivete. He stumbles around high society because it wouldn't occur to him to try to conform, or if it did, he wouldn't know quite how. This isn't a principled stance for Pierre the way it is for Andrei. It's simply who he is. He doesn't reject the drawing rooms of the world. He just never finds a comfortable seat in them. On the one hand, Pierre's lack of clarity about the world and his place in it makes him easily manipulable, sometimes aimless and a bit ridiculous. But on the other hand, he is refreshingly honest, earnest, curious, and unpredictable. After inheriting a great fortune, to his surprise, Pierre becomes the darling of society. Prince Vasily, the family relation who tried to and failed to secure the fortune for himself, pivots and begins to work on getting Pierre to marry his beautiful daughter, Hélène. Though malleable, Pierre is not unself-aware. Quote, "Hélène turned, looked straight at him with her shining dark eyes and smiled. 'So, you never noticed how beautiful I am,' she seemed to say. At that moment, Pierre felt that Hélène not only could, but must be his wife, that it could not be otherwise. He did not even know whether it would be good. He even felt that it was not good for some reason, but he knew it would be," end quote. As Vasily and Helene's matchmaking efforts ramp up, so does Pierre's inner reckoning. Quote, "But she's stupid. I've said myself that she's stupid. This isn't love. On the contrary, there's something vile in the feeling she aroused in me. Prince Vasily is her father. It is not good," end quote. Pierre's inner struggle prolongs the courtship uncomfortably. Everyone in society waiting for him to make a marriage proposal to this stunning woman whom they take to be his superior in every way. And ultimately, Prince Vasily, exasperated that his plans are not being realized, simply does it for Pierre. At an opportune moment in public, Vasily jumps up with great joy, rushing over to Pierre to congratulate him, even though Pierre has not, in fact, yet proposed. Pierre is often quick to say things, as he does in this moment, like, quote, "All this had to be so and could not be otherwise. Therefore, there's no point in asking whether it's good or bad," end quote. Such statements can seem like he's making excuses for his own passivity. And it does seem like he is at times carried from one action to another. But this tendency in him is complicated. It's not a justification for a lack of character. Although there is a kind of haziness or floppiness about Pierre's decision-making and his will to act, things do well up in him, and once he is moved to action, he acts with conviction and surprisingly great force. Pierre's sham of a marriage can't help but reveal itself. Hélène has an affair, and in an unexpected moment at a dinner party, Pierre's decisiveness surges forth and he challenges Hélène's lover to a duel. Pierre's abrupt and decisive action after his prolonged manipulation by Vasily and Hélène is a surprise to society, which has taken him to be bumbling. His conviction continues to show itself when Hélène comes to find him after the duel, certain she can guilt and shame him into reuniting with her. But Pierre rages, quote, jumping up from the sofa and staggering, rushed at her. "Out," he shouts, and she flees terrified. Similarly, when Vasily comes to resume control over Pierre, a great fury in Pierre sends him on his way. Pierre does have conviction and a moral core, but it is not, the way it can be in Andrei, a manifest standard that he holds himself to consciously. He doesn't seem to know or expect to know at any given moment what life will bring forth or how he will respond. He surprises himself and others. In fact, it often seems that Pierre is most effective when he is not trying to take control of things. His efforts to work out a meaningful path for himself can yield absurdities. He initiates reforms for the serfs working his land and celebrates their flourishing, when in fact the stewards of his estates are deceiving him. He convinces himself that, though he has never been to battle, he is meant to kill Napoleon and save Russia, and he roams the empty streets of Moscow, dagger tucked into his cloak. He decides it is necessary for him to go to the front, to experience the war firsthand, and he makes his way to the great battle of Borodino, his large figure standing out, a fat, ununiformed man wandering the battlefield, wearing a white hat, looking on as an observer, smiling. These efforts on his part are ridiculous, but interestingly, Pierre's less deliberative instincts are often quite effectual, admirable even. When Moscow is in flames, without thinking, he charges into a burning building to save a child he doesn't even know when no one else is willing. He shows unconditional love and support for Natasha, saving her at a great time of great moral suffering, not demanding that she love him back when that is painful for him. He is brave and thoughtful. When eventually imprisoned, he observes the execution of fellow Russians, knowing he is likely next, and is exposed to the incoherence of the life and death stakes of the war, wondering and worrying deeply about them and persevering, ultimately becoming stronger because of this exposure. And perhaps most importantly, as Prince Andrei rightly puts it, quote, "He has a heart of gold. He is the most absent-minded and ridiculous man, but he has a heart of gold," end quote. Throughout the book, Pierre, like Andrei, is drawn in and then disappointed by paths that promise deep meaning, purpose, and truth. Pierre is enlivened by his philanthropic work, his Masonic beliefs, by the promise of a heroic deed of self-sacrifice, by his romantic love for Natasha. In each instance, he is swept up, he blooms and his soul soars. With the Masons, quote, "With a swelling heart, with glittering eyes, Pierre gazed into the Mason's face and experienced a joyful feeling of peace, renewal, and return to life." With the philanthropy, quote, "Pierre was delighted by his visits to the estates and returned fully to that philanthropic state of mind and wrote rapturous letters to his mentor," end quote. With Natasha, gazing up at the comet in the sky, he thinks to himself how it, quote, "answered fully to what was in his softened and encouraged soul, now blossoming to new life," end quote. But here I risk turning some of the most beautiful moments in the book into absurdities by abstracting from the particulars. Though we might smile a bit as Pierre gets drawn into some of his projects, his instinctual connection to the wonder of the world and his commitment to be in touch with that wonder is rare, extraordinary actually. And he doesn't deceive himself about this tendency in himself. He, like Andrei, is reflective about the way in which the promise of his project sweeps him up and then abandons him. Many people, without a particularly strong will to truth, don't spend time wrestling with the fact that achieving our goals never seems to satisfy the urge that leads us to embark in the first place. But Pierre does recognize and struggle with this, and yet still, he does not give up on the bloom of the world. Pierre comes closest to something like Andrei's resignation in his month-long period of captivity. In extreme conditions, deprived of all comforts, Pierre experiences a transcendent freedom and joy that comes from a release of worldly attachment. relinquishing all pull toward particular people, particular goals and things. Quote, he had learned to see the great, the eternal, and the infinite in everything, end quote. However, weeks later, when Pierre is freed and returns to Moscow, still living according to this path, which has resulted in his, quote, putting himself on guard with all people so as not to bind himself to anything, end quote, he sees Natasha. She is changed, almost beyond recognition, and he is not sure it is her. But when her, quote, face, with its attentive eyes, with difficulty, with effort, like a rusty door opening, smiled, from that open door there suddenly breathed and poured out upon Pierre that long-forgotten happiness, of which, especially now, he was not even thinking. It breathed out, enveloped, and swallowed him whole. When she smiled, there could no longer be any doubt. It was Natasha, and he loved her, end quote. In this moment, though the lessons he learns in captivity stay with him for the rest of his life, Pierre's remove from the world doesn't stand a chance. He does not hesitate, but dives right back in. It is interesting that ultimately, unlike Pierre in this moment, Andrei's character cuts all ties with the living, including Natasha. In the final throes of his illness, it is his great love for her that binds Andrei to life. But in his final 2 days, he changes. He has a powerful dream, and on waking reflects, quote, yes, death is an awakening. Clarity suddenly came to his soul, and the curtain that until then had concealed the unknown was raised before his inner gaze, end quote. From that moment on, quote, in his words, in his tone, especially in that gaze, a cold, almost hostile gaze, there could be felt an alienation from everything of this world, because he understood something else, such as the living could not understand, which absorbed him entirely, end quote. While his death is deeply sad for the characters and for us, there is a way in which Andrei's will to truth always, in some respect, demanded something that did not belong to life. His steadfastness ultimately finds its full expression in death. For Pierre's character, on the other hand, his grand letting go, cultivated in captivity, which took the form not of disillusion, but of love for everything around him, and resulted in a relinquishing of all particular attachments, cannot withstand the pull of Natasha. In Moscow, after a long and intimate conversation with Natasha about all they've been through, Pierre tells her, quote, as long as there is life, there's happiness. There's much, much still to come. I'm not to blame that I am alive and want to live, and you do too, end quote. Part 4, absurdity. These different dispositions follow the characters through the novel. On the one hand, a kind of purism in Andrei that leads him to resist getting drawn into the world of appearances, knowing all too well the all-in, all-out character of the bloom it offers. And on the other hand, the buoyancy of Pierre, who always rebounds toward life. And it seems we are set up to compare them, to ask the question, who's right? Who is the hero, Pierre or Andrei? Embedded in this question is the one I began with. What is the appropriate attitude towards seeking truth and meaning in one's life? What is more absurd, relinquishing life and the search for meaning because the available answers always fall short, or embarking again and again, knowing that the promise is never realized? Andrei's will to truth is both admirable, sharp, brilliant, and when pushed to the extreme, in a sense, tragically absurd. Pierre's perpetual renewal is both life-giving, buoyant, and beautiful, and when pushed to the extreme, in a sense, comically absurd. This is a question familiar to us at St. John's. We, too, strive to push past the superficial, the ideological, the conventional, to discover something more true and fundamental about the world and ourselves, and we're passionate about the pursuit. Many students, and I myself along the way, have shared Andrei's worry about the way such striving and the beautiful realizations and insights it yields can both make us soar and seem to touch that which is most important, but also can and does send us plummeting back to the ground, to confusion and questioning. And on the other hand, at times, we feel in class an undisciplined bandying about from one set of blooming ideas to another with no directed commitment to pulling back the veil and getting to the truth. This, too, can be demoralizing and leave us empty. Ultimately, however, even though the book tempts us to want to solve the problem of the perpetual bloom, to lean in the direction of Andrei or Pierre, I don't think Tolstoy intends us to choose one or the other. I don't think we are meant to embrace the notion that true awakening, true understanding must lie outside the pull of life. Nor do I think Tolstoy is affirming a buoyancy where one rides the waves, relieved of the pursuit of the truth, having understood that, as Pierre says, quote, all this had to be so and could not be otherwise, therefore there's no point in asking, end quote. In fact, as I alluded to in the introduction, it may be possible to read the controversial epilogues of the book in this light. In a sense, the wave that breathes life into the book, soul soaring and then stranded, then soaring again, rolls to a close in the first epilogue. The narrative seems to land. Natasha, it is said, hardly needs to listen to Pierre when he speaks. She looks at him, quote, joyfully, long knowing all of what he was saying because she knows the whole soul of Pierre, end quote. In a sense, one might read the familial harmony in this first epilogue, while it lacks Prince Andrei, as realizing his great hope. One senses that the barrier between Pierre and Natasha's insides and outsides, between who they truly are and how they appear to be, has dissolved. Almost like gods, there is virtually no need for language between them. But, and we can argue about this in the question period, in that first epilogue, the story does not resemble what has come before, but becomes somehow flat, unrealistic, and static. In the second epilogue, on the other hand, the characters disappear, and we get Tolstoy's full-blown theory of history, in which he argues that our notion that the consequences of human action are directed by meaning and purpose is an illusion. As he puts it, quote, every event that takes place inevitably coincides with some expressed desire, and receiving its justification is seen as a product of the will of one or more persons, end quote. But in fact, quote, the totality of causes of phenomena is inaccessible to the human mind, end quote. As he puts it, rather than having discoverable reasons, an event takes place, quote, simply because it had to take place, end quote. If we are honest, Tolstoy suggests, the more we try to explain the events of human life sensibly, quote, the more senseless and incomprehensible they become, end quote. If we see in the first epilogue one potential resolution to Andrei's opposition between that which is infinitely great and that which is narrow and worldly, namely the harmony of godly post-bloom humans, the second epilogue gives us another kind of resolution, something like the limit case of Pierre's all this had to be so, end quote. If it is an illusion that the human pursuit of meaning can never touch the truth itself, then abandoning our efforts and allowing what will be to be seems the only way forward. But the staticness of the first epilogue is matched by the total abstraction and, in a sense, hollowness of the second, which threatens to strip the previous 1,000 pages of their greatness. And I think we know better than that. I can't help but wonder if these two strange endings taken together, one where we find an eternal home and leave the cave, so to speak, and one where we cease trying to turn toward the sun altogether, is perhaps the only way to end this novel. There has to be a final page. The book must end. But something about the truth that the book conveys does not allow either for a totalizing ending or for the invocation of non-ending in principle. Each misrepresents the potency we have experienced at Tolstoy's own hand. Does Tolstoy create underwhelming final gestures to elicit a perpetual turning back, one that doesn't let us either land the narrative once and for all or undermine its hold on us, but compels us time and a time again back toward the middle? Conclusion: friendship and philosophy. When Pierre visits Andrei, after the Battle of Austerlitz, post-Sky, he detects that Andrei seems to have given up on the search for meaning altogether. Pierre is, quote, struck by the change that has taken place in Prince Andrei, his gaze extinguished, dead, end quote. During this time, Pierre has become enthralled by the teachings of the Freemasons and longs to talk to Andrei about everything he's thinking. It takes a while, with a number of false starts, but eventually Pierre's talk provokes Andrei, enlivening him from his deadly pallor. They begin to discuss and argue. Prince Andrei defending his principled detachment, Pierre trying to pull him in. The scene is framed as two men thinking seriously together about the meaning and purpose of life. Ultimately, Pierre does not convert Prince Andrei to the Masonic teachings, but this is somehow besides the point. We watch as an important transformation in Andrei occurs. As Pierre pours out all he is thinking and feeling, he worries that Prince Andrei will mock him or be angry. Andrei looks ahead, listening. Quote, a few times he asked Pierre to repeat words he had not heard because of the noise of the carriage. By a particular gleam that lit up Prince Andrei's eyes and by his silence, Pierre saw that his words were not in vain, that Prince Andrei would not interrupt him or laugh at what he was saying, end quote. As afternoon turns to evening, Pierre and Andrei board a ferry to cross a flooded river. The carriage and the horses are loaded on. In that liminal space between day and night, suspended on the water, Prince Andrei leans on the rail, looking, quote, silently down the floodwaters, sparkling in the setting sun, end quote. The flood of Pierre's ideas has slowed. Well, what do you think about that? Pierre asks Andrei. Why are you silent? And Prince Andrei answers, I've been listening to you, that's all. Andrei, elbow on the rail of the ferry, does not take his eyes off the water, the red gleam of the sun on the blue floodwaters, and Pierre falls silent. Quote, it was completely still. Prince Andrei sighed, and with a luminous, childlike, tender gaze, looked into the flush, rapturous face of Pierre, end quote. Something deep in Andrei begins to shift. Quote, he looked at the sky, and for the first time since Austerlitz saw that high, eternal sky he had seen as he lay on the battlefield, and something long asleep, something that was best in him, suddenly awakened joyfully and young in his soul, end quote. Andrei is moved, not because Pierre's ideas provide a QED argument about the meaning of life that convinces him. Their exchange is not a transaction in which Prince Andrei, seeking for a missing piece to a puzzle, either is or isn't satisfied with what Pierre has to offer. The satisfaction Pierre and Andrei both experience on the ferry is of a different sort. In the novel, our attention is called to the way in which again and again human actions, projects, theories fail to preserve the transcendent character of the sky. When we insist that that which is of the sky land and find a stable home in the world, we inevitably corrupt the sublimity that we sense. But on the ferry, drifting between the banks, Pierre and Andrei do find a landing. But what kind of landing is this? If it is true that we need to be reminded, jarred, awoken to encounter the sky, might it be the case that the other human beings have the potential to be our most potent reminders? On the one hand, most of our interactions with people are ordinary. We live together in the drawing rooms of the world. But the fact that we are not totally knowable to each other constantly announces itself, even in those drawing rooms. We talk to each other, reach out to probe each other through conversation. We flirt with each other or try to manipulate each other, precisely because we acknowledge that beyond the surface, the other person has thoughts, feelings, intentions that are not fully known to us, that the other person is somehow more. We encounter each other simultaneously as objects in the humdrum of the ordinary world and as question marks. We might be tempted to think that this unknowability is just due to the lack of familiarity, and the question mark is resolved the better acquainted we become with someone. But in fact, the closer we become, or perhaps the dearer we become to each other, the more it is clear that the opacity is not just a matter of familiarity, as though at some point, with enough talk, we could know each other all the way down. In conversations of the sort that Pierre and Andrei have, The fact that the speakers are not totally known to each other, or, and this is important, not totally known to themselves, is not a barrier to be overcome. In fact, the blossoming of their conversation depends on the recognition of, and in a sense, the actual entry into their own indeterminacy. The indeterminacy calls them and the world as they understand it into question. Andrei presses Pierre, quote, "You say, we'll show you the goal of life and the purpose of man and the laws that govern the world. But who are we? Just people. How do you know everything? How is it that I alone do not see what you see?" End quote. But rather than sending them into a tailspin, the shifting ground, the back and forth of the conversation moves them from Andrei's, quote, "low, oppressive vault in which everything is clear and nothing eternal or mysterious," end quote, into the sky of their own being. In philosophical conversation, as aspects of ourselves that we didn't even know were there, or thoughts we do not yet know ourselves to possess, present themselves, we have the extraordinary possibility of being present to the more of what we are, not as a potential to be realized, but as the condition, present already, that is making our activity possible. The more is present and real. Without it, our conversation could never get off the ground. Together, in the beam of friendship and philosophy, a vastness which could never take a final determinate form is affirmed and creates a sky-laden landing where we find each other, not fully revealed, not turned inside out, but like Andrei, where the best in us is suddenly joyfully awakened. We know something of this sky-laden landing here at St. John's. At our best, and we know this doesn't always happen, but at our best, the seminar table pulls away from the bank. Conversation reveals itself to be more, so much more, than a transaction of ideas, a contest of wills, a solving of a puzzle. When we invite the indeterminacy in, and we listen to each other, as Andrei listens to Pierre, we find ourselves, for a time, existing together out in the open. It is true, of course, that in our wandering and wondering, inevitably, we're pulled back toward the banks, toward the who is the hero, Pierre or Andrei question, ever enticed by the first or second epilogue, final totalizing answers, or by the suspicion of the pursuit of truth altogether. In such moments, struggling again to make sense of why we engage in this activity, why we think it's of utmost importance rather than absurd, it is helpful to have friends who also struggle with this question. Friends around the seminar table, but also friends that span the ages, nestled in our bookshelves. It is a beautiful question whether books can be friends and what this means. In some sense, the idea of an ending designed to elicit attention that invites us again and again to turn back toward the middle seems like a start to me. We say here at St. John's that our books are great because we can never be done with them. They teach us something new every time we read them. This is, in part, a way of pointing to the possibility of genius, human minds that are so extraordinary that we can learn from them forever. It is also, and I think even more so, though this might in fact be the same thing, pointing to the way in which the questions the books ask, the thinking and writing that these authors are engaged in, are not attempts to transmit a final, codifiable set of answers, though it might seem that way at first. Rather, the books beckon us, invite us into the great human conversation, which is not to land, but to embark. When the vault of the sky descends, and it's hard to recall the mystery and wonder of the world, the tremendous narrative of war and peace elicits such grand movement of soul that it's impossible not to remember what it means to encounter ourselves, our endless, indeterminate sky selves, in the eyes of another. This book is a friend. Together with your classmates, your tutors, your books, let this be a year of friendship. Welcome back to St. John's.